Used to go to a tavern, and as we're drinking the beer, somebody would say, "Give me an H, give me an I, give me an L," and they'd spell out Heilgeschichte. And by this time, everybody's looking at us going, "What in the world? I can't spell it for you, I do it all." And what in the world are they doing? They go, "What's that spell?" We all yell out, Heilgeschichte. What's that mean? I don't know.
I don't know.
What it means is salvation history. The Bible is written to talk about how God is saving and redeeming his people and restoring his people in the world back the way he intended it to be. So it's history from a point of view. It's not objective. The Bible is not objective history. The Bible is subjective history, telling about God's actions in the world and through his people and what God is doing and accomplishing through them. Does that make sense? So when we read a real historian talk about these times, he doesn't talk about the Holy Spirit, and he doesn't talk about, well, he may mention that they preached or something, but he doesn't get into the contents. He was not going to give the contents of what Stephen, for example, preached about. A real historian would just look at the facts and try to analyze based upon archaeology, other historians outside of the Bible, to try to determine what really happened. So would you like to know what that was? I got your curiosity?
Yeah.
How does a real historian view what the rise of Christianity in those early centuries? And this is a book by the name of The Triumph of Christianity, which is a history book, but for me it just read like a novel. I was totally enthralled with it.
What's the title of
The Triumph of Christianity. The subtitle is How the Jesus Movement Became the World's Largest Religion. But I'd like to read to you some of what I think is interesting in this early church, understanding kind of the setting that they found themselves in. And then how the church, in the historian's eyes, actually worked. And I think the two tie together pretty good. First of all, the early church, and this isn't from I don't think it was from Starks where I got this. This is another, I think, an Old Testament scholar, who said that he can find no records of the early church proclaiming that when you die, you go to heaven. The message of the early church, even throughout all the persecutions, was not when you die, you go to heaven. That's not how they got people into the church, was by talking that kind of language. Yes, they believed that when you die, there was certainly life after death and a resurrection of the body, and they believed that. But that was not their main message in terms of evangelism or taking Jesus out. So, according to Starks then, he said the message that people gave to people at that time was that Christianity makes life better here and now. Not merely in psychological ways, as faith in an afterlife can do, but in terms of concrete worldly benefits. And what he quotes here is a study done on ancient tombstones that established that early Christians outlived their pagan neighbors. It was healthy to be a Christian in those times. Okay? They had a better quality of life. Now, we picture all the persecutions and all the stuff and kind of think it must have been terrible for them. Well, it was. But it was better for them than it was for their pagan neighbors. And I don't think we often get that. It says, Jesus' ministry, as we know, was in rural areas, but most of the growth of the early church was in urban areas, not in rural areas. So Galilee would be a rural community, small towns. But in the urban centers is where things really took off. And he goes into a lot about numbers in terms of how numerically things get exaggerated back then. So he even thinks that perhaps the 3,000 that were baptized on Pentecost may be a somewhat exaggerated number. It may mean a lot were baptized that day. That the closer to the number of Christians that were there, it says in Acts 1, it says about 129. That's about the extent of Christians, the apostles and those who were following Jesus, kind of at the ascension before Pentecost. It was a very small number. Okay? So there wasn't a large group then that Jesus had pulled together after listening to him teach and preach and all his miracles and all the things he did. That what we discover, it was a very small number of people who were often very fearful that they were going to suffer the fate that Jesus had.
Does he give us rationale for that? How he calculates that number?
Yeah.
It's just a number, it's not that important, but I'm curious.
Let me just read what he says. Ancient history has long suffered from many exaggerated numerical claims offered in the original sources. Many armies of perhaps 10,000 were said to number in the hundreds of thousands or even as many as 1 million. These are all footnoted. Similar exaggerations distort city sizes. For example, Josephus, who was a Jewish historian, reported that 1st century CE there were more than 204 villages in Galilee and that the smallest of these had a population of 15,000. In fact, Sepphoris, the largest city in Galilee, probably did not have as many as 5,000 residents, and most villages probably had fewer than 100. Consider that in this era, Jerusalem's population probably exceeded 25,000 only when it was crowded with refugees fleeing Roman armies. Despite ancient claims that more than 1 million Jews were slaughtered when Jerusalem fell to Titus in 70.
Wow.
So historians are saying you may have a little bit of exaggeration going on. And we know that from the Old Testament.
Sure.
You know, whenever the number 40 is used, it means a long time. I mean, 40 days, 40 nights, 40 years in the wilderness, 40, a long time. Long time.
Who's the author?
Rodney Starks.
How do you spell the last name?
Good question. S-T-A-R-K.
Stark.
Stark. Rodney.
What do you think that the cities in those days, very practically, were so big? Because what are they going to do? Sewage? What are they going to do? Getting water?
Well,
You just-
glad you asked that question.
Good question. Other big.
Let's see. Just looking at other city sizes, Corinth had, when Paul visited, Corinth probably had 50,000, Thessalonica 35,000, Athens 75. Even Rome, then the largest city in the world, probably had a population of 450,000. Although, then he goes on to cite old ancient sources that say over 1 million. But here's the key. These cities were densely overcrowded. Rome suffered from probably the greatest density. One person estimates it had 302 people per acre. 302 people per acre. So consider we're sitting here in 3 acres. 302. What do you think Calcutta, India is?
Probably a little more dense population than that.
10 times that maybe.
Yeah, 122. So 3 times Calcutta.
Oh, really?
Oh, Rome is 3 times.
3 times Calcutta.
Yes.
Yeah. So let me keep reading. I found this interesting. Maybe you won't. It says, 302 people per acre compared with 122 in modern Calcutta and 100 in Manhattan. I've estimated the density of Antioch is 195 per acre. And other major cities of the day had densities comparable to Antioch.
That's a little bit misleading because New York is built so three-dimensionally.
That's right. Well,
If you cut that off, it's population density down quite a bit.
that's right, but because it's up.
Yeah.
You got everybody who, you go up. Well, what do you think they did in Rome? Same thing. They went up.
But not to the extent.
Yeah, so these are not single one-level houses, they're two-story houses. You can't put 302 people in two-story houses on an acre. You know, I've been to the Philippines and the squatter villages, and you don't have 302 per acre in those little squats. They went up, and that's exactly what happened. So you've got these major density, you've got roads. He said most streets were so narrow that we would consider them to be footpaths. Although Roman law required all streets to be at least 9.5 feet wide, many were narrower.
A chariot, right? How much is a chariot?
I don't know. Yeah. So 9.5 feet was what it was supposed to be, and many were less than that. So a table and a half. That's not a real wide street. Now what you want to do then is, it says that the streets, in parts of ancient cities, streets were so narrow that if people leaned out of their windows, they could chat with someone living across the street without having to raise their voices. The crowding, combined with the fact that everything except a few temples and palaces were constructed of wood, covered with stucco, and that all heating and cooking was done over open fires, explains why dread of fire was an obsession among rich and poor alike. And then you also had collapse of buildings. In Rome, it was illegal to construct a building